Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Research America's Alliance member web meeting. I am so pleased to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Peter Marks, the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, better known as CBER, at the FDA. Dr. Marks has played one of the leading roles in the agency's oversight of COVID-19 vaccines. And he joined us on December 14th, right after the first emergency use authorization. And we're very grateful that he has made time to join us again after a third COVID-19 vaccine has been authorized. And as per usual, type your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and my colleague Terry Schwartzbeck will answer them during our Q&A, which I know Dr. Marks has left plenty of time for. I'm so pleased to turn it over to you for an update, Dr. Marks. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks very much. I'm going to start by spending probably about 15 minutes with a slide presentation that'll hopefully summarize things and get us started here. So let me share my screen here. Go. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to very briefly review how we've accelerated vaccine development, talk about the 3 emergency use authorized vaccines, just because it's helpful to have them next to each other for comparison right now. Talk a little bit about COVID-19 variants and where we are going with these, why they are top of mind, and talk a little bit about the use of COVID-19 vaccines, because that allows me to get into some of the frequently asked questions. So just to remind everyone, the way we have been able to see several COVID-19 vaccines authorized so quickly is because traditional vaccine development, which is a process in which the risk factors for developing a vaccine are minimized by proceeding in a very orderly series of development stages and waiting to start to manufacture until the very end of those stages, is something that usually takes several years. What happened in this case of accelerated vaccine development is that various places where there would normally be gaps between phase 1 and phase 2 of development, phase 2 and 3 development, they were eliminated. And so we saw, for instance, even phase 1, 2, 3 trials in the case of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And also, instead of waiting till the end to really scale up manufacturing, we saw manufacturing scale up early on once it appeared that there was any hint of efficacy of these vaccines. And so at the time that these were actually authorized, there were millions of doses waiting to be given. Now, one could argue there should have been even more millions of doses, but honestly, compared to how vaccine manufacturing normally goes, this was a significant departure. The process was accelerated by the fact that we gave clear guidance on what we expected from these vaccine products. People knew what the bar was. We had early conversations with the manufacturers. The manufacturers had very open access to regulators, where we've turned things around with quite unusual timeframes in terms of being faster than usual. We've had this integrating phases into one clinical trial. Now, that's something we do all the time, but it's not something that's done quite as commonly in vaccines. And so this concept of phase 1, 2, 3, or phase 1, 2, and then 2, 3 trials made a difference. Manufacturing at risk and making products available via an optimal regulatory pathway were important. And we put this all into guidance documents so that it would be out there for the public to see that we set a bar, for instance, of 50% effectiveness for the development and licensure of these vaccines compared to placebo. And we had a path forward for emergency use authorization so that they would be made available more quickly than it would take to have the company submit a biologics license application with all of the intended detailed manufacturing information, detailed presentation that would require, which usually takes months to prepare. So biologics license applications is how we normally would make available vaccines. And we have a standard that there has to be substantial evidence of efficacy from adequate and well-controlled clinical trials. That's the same for a new drug. Um, uh, for emergency use authorization, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, there was this idea that, look, if you had stuff on the shelf that could potentially help someone who'd been the victim of a chemical, biological, or radionuclear event, you would want to use that even if it was an investigational agent, and it might need to be deployed in a way that was not done with the normal informed consent that you would use under a clinical trial. So that was this emergency use authorization allows us to take investigational agents that may be effective, whose known and potential benefits outweigh their known and potential risks, and make them available. And that's been done now for therapeutics. When we started to think about using this for vaccines given to millions upon millions of otherwise healthy individuals, we felt we needed to explain why that was a reasonable thing to do. And that's why that for COVID-19 vaccine, we noted that things would have to demonstrate clear and compelling efficacy in a large, well-designed phase 3 clinical trial. So basically saying that the vaccines would need to operate closer to the ceiling of a BLA, kind of like a chandelier hanging down from the ceiling, rather than at the floor of an EUA. And we tried to do so in a very transparent manner, doing things at a public advisory committee meeting, so that people could see that this is not something that's being kind of snuck through, but these are safe and effective products that can be used. We noted that obviously there are certain things you can't do in a shortened time. You can't make up for having 6 months of safety follow-up when you don't have 6 months to get it in. And so that's why we also noted that we'd have to do a fair amount of post-deployment surveillance. So we now have 3 emergency use authorized candidates that are there under emergency use. The 2 mRNA vaccines from Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, and most recently the non-replicating viral vector from Janssen. These are all making the spike protein by different ways. The 2 mRNA vaccines make them in the same manner, which is the mRNA leads to expression of the protein on the cell surface, and then an antibody response is generated. The non-replicating viral vector is a virus that can't actually reproduce itself, but its DNA allows the production, the host cell machinery to produce the protein. It's expressed on the cell in the same way one gets an immune response. There are 3 other vaccines in more advanced stages of development. The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which is deployed in other places in the world, not yet authorized in the United States. There's the Novavax protein subunit vaccine, which instead of asking the body's machinery to produce the protein, you just give the protein along with an immune stimulant called an adjuvant. And that is in a phase 3 trial currently. We'll know the results of that in the coming few months. And Sanofi is a little further behind with their protein subunit vaccine, but they're coming along as well. So what about these trials? So all 3 of the emergency use authorized vaccines, the top line messages, they are very good vaccines that are good at helping to prevent COVID-19. But let me tell you about what they are here. So the Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and Janssen vaccines all were large clinical trial programs involving 30,000 people or more, total patients, about half of which received vaccine and half received placebo. They mirrored the demographics of our country. Now, the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna trials were performed primarily in the United States, whereas the Janssen trial was performed about half in the United States and half overseas in a combination of locations that included South Africa, locations in South America, and in Mexico. But that's why the number of Hispanic, Latino, and Black African American patients or individuals or subjects are increased. And you can see they all had a fair number of people who were over age 65. If you look at vaccine efficacy, the most important top line message here is that all of the vaccines perform similarly in keeping people out of the hospital or dying from COVID-19. So that's the really important top line message. If one looks at the efficacy against moderate to severe COVID-19, in other words, COVID-19 that didn't land you in the hospital, there does seem to be this difference here between 94, 95% with Moderna, Pfizer, BioNTech, and 66% in the overall trial with Janssen. Although if you just look in the United States portion, the effectiveness was about 72 to 74%, depending on whether you look at day 14 or day 28. These weren't head-to-head comparisons, and the Janssen vaccine was also being studied in South Africa, where indeed there is the South African variant, which is more resistant, at least we believe, to the antibodies that are produced to these vaccines. So again, can't say head to head, but these are all very, very good vaccines. If we look at their safety, there is what I've shown you here is a combined placebo. If you take the different vaccines and essentially average the percentage of adverse effects seen, it's a little bit of a synthetic group, but it just gives you an idea of what to see. You can see that after the second dose of the mRNA vaccine, there are some things that you do see. There's some fatigue, headache, flu-like symptoms, and those are not minimal. Those are, in some people, they do keep them out of activity for a day. So we warn people of them. The good news is that none of them have been so serious that they have precluded. They usually get better within a day or two. There have been occasional people we've heard that have had some significant joint pain. We're looking into that, but again, nothing that is out of the ordinary for what we've seen with vaccines. You can see with placebo, there is a fair amount of fatigue and headache in baseline, and so you can understand what you're comparing that to. Um, Obviously, as we get more information about these vaccines, now that we've had millions upon millions of people vaccinated, we'll probably be able to refine this more and more. I can say to you that with the vSafe text monitoring system, which I'll tell you more about, that CDC has been running, these numbers that were obtained in the clinical trial are being replicated pretty closely. So these probably are real side effects from the vaccines. But the good news again is that generally somewhere between 24 and 36 hours after the vaccines, people are feeling better. Our safety monitoring is obviously something we have to do very carefully here. We are looking to make sure that there are no serious adverse events. What I just told you about were things that are really not so serious. What we're concerned about too is to make sure that there aren't anything that's more serious that needs to be monitored and dealt with. And so we have both passive monitoring through the vaccine adverse event reporting system. That's the traditional, you send in a report through MedWatch. And we have the vSafe text monitoring system that the CDC has put in place where you opt in to get messages to report side effects. And then we have active monitoring through both CDC, through their vaccine safety data link and the clinical immunization safety assessment, and through our systems, such as the CMS Medicare database system and the Sentinel Best system, which cover more than 100 million lives. Those claims-based systems can be very helpful for us in looking at whether there are certain adverse events that are coming up. And we're looking at 15 outcomes of interest. They're outcomes of interest because they've occurred with other vaccines that have been rolled out in the past. One of the safety signals that did come up early on was this issue of allergic reactions. It came up within the first days that the vaccine was deployed in the United Kingdom before we had it even authorized here in the United States. As it turns out, these severe allergic reactions are relatively uncommon, but we still mandate that people be asked if they've had allergic reactions to vaccines previously or other medications, and the vaccination sites have to have uh, the equipment on site to be able to deal with a severe allergic reaction. The rates have come down to what looks like about 1 in 200 to 1 in 250,000 individuals. So the rate, the baseline rate for an average vaccine, if you look, it's probably 1 in 1 million. So it's a little higher than that 1 in 1 million for these vaccines, but not that much so. So finally, what about these COVID-19 variants? There are now at least 4 different variants circulating in the United States, but probably many, many more subvariants of these major variants. And we have to deal with those. And we've put together a plan at FDA for how we will adapt COVID-19 vaccines if we get to the point that we feel that the current generation of vaccines are unable to adequately address the circulating variants in the United States. We're lucky in that the mRNA vaccines can be rapidly switched from one to another from a manufacturing standpoint. So it's just a matter of doing the pre-work to be ready to make that switch. And that's why we're working with the manufacturers to do the animal studies needed for potentially new strains, for instance, the South African variant. We're also talking about relatively small studies in a few hundred individuals to help look at the efficacy of these vaccines against the new strain as well as the original strain to understand if it remains effective against the original strain as well, and it's effective against the newer variant that is being addressed. We're also making sure that you can give these as a booster to people who've already had these vaccines to make sure there's no issue with getting a third immunization with an mRNA vaccine. We don't anticipate there will be an issue, but it's probably a good idea to find these things out in advance before we need to switch into a new vaccine if that's actually ever necessary. So we are ready to deal with this. Hopefully, our current generation of vaccines, and all evidence seems to point to the fact that the current 3 vaccines that are deployed seem to be able to handle the variants that we have currently circulating. We have those data from clinical experience with Janssen, which is a strength for that particular vaccine, and we have it in the laboratory for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, where it appears that their neutralizing capacity is sufficiently in excess of what's present, what's needed for even the South African variant, even if it's not quite as strong against those as the other variants. So these are reasons why there are a bunch of questions that have come up that I have some answers to based on that. So we hear a lot about, well, could we delay administering the second doses so that we could get more people with first dose and arm? Well, we now have a 1-dose vaccine, so that's great. Just you can use that once we have enough of it. But giving single doses of 2-dose vaccines probably isn't a good idea, as well as giving half doses of certain vaccines. And the reason for that is because we understand that for these variants, you need high antibody titers in order to prevent the South African variant in a way that is effective. The high antibody titers probably make up for the fact that there are parts of the molecule, the S protein, that are not recognized by the antibodies that you make to the vaccine. But if you have enough antibodies against the part of the molecule that the vaccine recognizes, you still are able to clear and kill the virus. So probably we shouldn't sell ourselves short, especially with these variants becoming increasingly prevalent across the United States. It probably will only take another month or two, and we will be mostly either UK variant or South African variant or some combination of the two that are fighting against each other to take over the number of cases that they're infecting. The other thing is mixing and matching vaccines probably is not a good idea because we just don't know the safety of how that will work. So don't do those things. And I would leave you here that if you don't have time to do it right, you may not have time to do it over. And that's more relevant here. This saying from Seth Godin is probably more relevant here than you might think, because variants arise when you don't control uh, the virus. There were these crazy theories that maybe convalescent plasma helped cause these and other things. That's not. I can't buy into that. The way you get variants is you have lots of viral replication, and so whatever you do with vaccines to reduce viral replication is good. And so I think we want to make sure that we don't leave people suboptimally protected so they can end up getting infected and have viral replication, which will lead to more variants. So I'll stop here, but what we've tried to do is shorten vaccine development timelines without compromising safety and effectiveness, and do so in a transparent manner that ultimately helps us so that we understand um, that vaccine, and we want people to understand that this was a process that they can trust, and so that some of the issues with vaccine confidence decline and people are more willing to get vaccinated. So I look forward to questions, and thanks for listening.
Dr. Marks, thank you as always. Crystal clear and detailed. I'm going to throw out a question, and I know we already have a few that have come in from our audience. When you were here in December, there were several questions about what we might refer to as special populations, pregnant women, people who are immunocompromised, children. Just wondered if we have more data on any of those three or other key special populations.
I got three. This is great. I have three fingers. I'll take them, and I can. That way, my fingers will be my memory here. Let's start with children. So right now, there are studies going on with children ages 12 to 15 or 12 to 17, depending on the vaccine. The hope is that for at least for the mRNA vaccines, by the time we get towards the summer, we will have data so that we will be able to vaccinate junior high and high school students before they have to go back to school or in the fall, before they might go back to school in the fall. And so if everything goes right, if there are no untoward findings in terms of safety, we would expect that we will start to see that again, hopefully by early, it all depends, but early summerish, we're hoping. Can't give you an exact time, but hopefully early in the summer we'll start to see data where we could have a change in the emergency use authorization to facilitate that. So the younger children, it's going to take a little longer, and that's because we have to be cautious. We don't want to see this multiple inflammatory syndrome after vaccination if we have to vaccinate children who might have had COVID before, or vice versa. So it's going to require a little more safety follow-up, and will probably take us into the fall to get those data. So I don't want to give any false impression that that's going to happen, instantly. We need to do that carefully, and those data won't be available till the fall at the earliest. And then we have pregnant women. Pregnant women, there are studies that are starting up, but honestly, pregnant women have decided, based on conversations with their physicians, to get vaccinated, because the risks of having COVID-19 when you're pregnant are pretty significant, and can cause pregnancy loss and other maternal and fetal complications. So right now we know that well over 30,000 women who are pregnant have gotten vaccinated. There are even now women who have been giving birth who have been vaccinated. So we're starting to see that come through. There are over 1,000 women who have enrolled in a CDC pregnancy registry, and there are more enrolling every day. So those will all hopefully give us more data as we roll forward into the summer. And we're committed to trying to continue to make that available. For the immunocompromised, those studies are not yet started. But I think the party line here right now is for the mRNA vaccines, which are not live viral vaccines. These are vaccines that the chance of them harming someone is probably pretty low. The real issue there is a benefit risk discussion about whether they'll have the efficacy that they might otherwise. Hard to imagine that they're going to hurt because unlike a live viral vector, it's not like they could get out of control in an immunocompromised individual. It's just that they might not work as well. But that's a discussion for individuals to have with their physician. So I think I got, I think I
You
got those
did.
three.
You got all three. I'm going to turn it over to Terry for some questions from the audience.
Sure thing. Thanks, Dr. Marks. One question, we now, as you mentioned, have 3 vaccines that have been granted in EUA. Do you think we'll be seeing other manufacturers applying for something later this year?
I think it's not unlikely that we'll see other EUAs come along, EUA requests come along.
Great. And here's another one. Are we seeing any data from clinical trials or any perhaps real world evidence collection that would help guide patients with complex rare diseases in their decisions about getting a vaccine?
Yeah, we hopefully we'll start to get enough people vaccinated that we can start to use our large databases to get some information on that. But we haven't looked at that yet. But it's something that is on the list of things to do, because you're right, for rare diseases, people with various less common conditions, the only way we're going to get there is, at least in the short term, is by looking at the large databases. And we can also, the lucky thing is we can do that also globally with our global partners. And that's something we're talking about as well, because when you bin the European population is about a little larger, but not that much larger. It's about the size of our population. The two together, though, gives a very nice size database. So we will continue to work with the Europeans on this.
Great. Another question. Do we think we'll get any more information, or are you expecting us to get more information about the question of whether or not a vaccinated individual can in fact transmit COVID to unvaccinated folks?
Yeah, I expect we're going to have more information in the coming months. I think right now we're already starting to feel better about this question. I think we know from the Janssen vaccine data, as well as some of the data from Moderna, and which is that it looks like there's less asymptomatic carriage. In other words, you see fewer asymptomatic cases of COVID-19, which means there are fewer asymptomatic carriers going around and spreading COVID-19 in vaccinated individuals. So the hope would be that we'll be able to show, when the study does complete, that is looking at nasal swabs after vaccination, so that you really know that you're not missing the ability to transmit. We'll know for sure. The animal data would suggest that this is going to be the case, but it would be nice to have the human data. We'll also have data from real world evidence studies. Probably data coming out of Israel will be the first that will help us with this, where it will become clear, because they're going to probably get towards herd immunity more quickly than anyone else, because they will probably have the first population that is close to a 70% vaccinated. And we'll hopefully be able to make some larger statement about that. So bottom line, we don't know for sure, but I think if I had to give you a gestalt, it's that it's looking good. Whether it's 100%, we can't say, but look to the CDC. The CDC should be releasing some guidelines on what vaccinated individuals can do or not do, and look to those guidelines, because I think you'll see this degree of confidence is probably reflected will be reflected in those guidelines. I can't say more at this point, but have a look when they come out.
Great. Another question for those preparing to get a vaccine. Are there any precautions they can take regarding reducing the likelihood of experiencing some of these symptoms immediately after vaccination?
Yeah, probably the most important thing. I don't know what you can do to prevent that. I mean, one thing is, first of all, try not to have to get some other vaccine within the 2 weeks before you're going to get vaccinated. Okay, we would prefer people not to have another vaccine for the 2 weeks prior to vaccination, so it doesn't confuse things. Number one. Number two, particularly if you're a younger person getting one of the mRNA vaccines, after your second dose, you might want to just try to get it try to get it earlier in the day if you can, and just know that the rest of the day you might not want to have a big day planned. If you get it later in the day, that's okay too. Just know that the next day you might not want to have a lot planned. Um, because for the first 24 to 36 hours after you get the vaccine, you may feel more fatigued. Um, I can say from personal experience, yeah, you know, I didn't. I would say the vaccine was extremely tolerable, and I'm not a good test subject because I don't know whether the reason why I feel extra tired on a given day is because I'm only getting like 4 to 5 hours of sleep a night, or because I got the vaccine. But I could imagine that I felt a little more tired after my second dose of one of the mRNA vaccines.
Got it. Thank you. And we have put in the chat, by the way, that new guidelines that just came out from the CDC regarding guidelines for vaccinated individuals.
Great, there it is.
Yes.
Okay.
There you go.
Terry, I'm gonna ask a question. And with being on 4 or 5 hours of sleep, this may not be a fair question, particularly without notes in front of you, Dr. Marks. I'm joking, but what have we learned from a regulatory science perspective that we might be able to apply to future vaccine trials and even submissions for other diseases that are, non-COVID related?
It's a really great question. So I think a couple things. Let's start with the basic development. I think what we have confirmed something that at least our center suspected before this, but is absolutely true, which is that if you have extensive dialogue early on, you can really save a lot of time down the road. So I think what will come out of this, at least for me, is that extensive early dialogue with sponsors is ever more important. And I'm very happy that we have our Interact program in place, which facilitates that. I think we're just going to have to find a way to make that more more user friendly, because right now the timing of that is just it's not within what most sponsors can really take. We need to be able to do that more quickly. So that's one thing. Obviously, that early dialogue. Another thing I think will come out of this is that, especially if you have products that you think ultimately will be successful, start to deal with manufacturing once and for all earlier rather than later, because it's been a theme over the past years, especially in the cell and gene therapy area, but it was clearly here in this vaccine and other therapeutic area that you have to be able to make your products if they work. And if you wait to find out that they seem to work and then decide to try to scale up, it's too late. It's too late for things, especially in these kind of emergency situations. But even for patients, let's say for rare disease patients, you don't want to have a product that works and then wait a year before you can actually market it because you can finally make it. So I think the importance of manufacturing is there. And then finally, I think there's another issue, which is for the larger ecosystem, which is that our system will need to have the capacity to scale up production in the event of future emergencies in a way that we simply didn't have this time. And we need to be able to address this need, this manufacturing need.
Thank you. Really helpful. Terry?
Great. So building on what you just mentioned, actually, about production and actually maybe actually getting things done, President Biden has said that we hope to have enough supply for all adults by the end of May. What needs to happen? What needs to happen to get us there?
I think the good news is I think they just need to keep working at the fact, as long as there is not some problem. In other words, as long as there's no explosions or other things, and they happen, believe it or not, I've been around long enough. As long as these factories keep going, as long as there aren't lot failures or anything, we should be in pretty good track to get to where we need to go. And they're still trying to build up additional capacity here for not just for the mRNA vaccines, but also for the non-viral and for the protein-based vaccines. So I think my guess is that, this, at least everything that I can see, says that these predictions for having a very adequate vaccine supply starting in April, where probably the supply starting in April, at some point in April, the supply will probably exceed our ability to get things into arms. And then we'll be having to focus on getting more people out there to be able to get vaccine in arms. So that's a good problem to have.
Yeah, I can't believe that literally a year ago, think about where we were, and now to be talking to you and hearing you say we just got to keep doing what we're doing. That is just the most amazing thing. What do we know along similar lines, though, about the duration of immunity, especially versus having the disease itself versus the immunity we get from the vaccine? Do we have a sense yet of how long this is going to last?
We don't, and it's going to be really a bit of a challenge here. We're going to have to follow people over the course of the coming year. Those who have been in the clinical trials, as well as those who've had COVID-19 and those who have had COVID-19 who've been vaccinated. All the different people we're going to have to follow. We know that the vaccine probably gives at least 6 months of protection because we can follow people that long. And we're hoping it's at least a year or more, but we won't know that until we actually have larger data sets. That said, I just want to make sure this comes up even among very well-educated people. Get vaccinated, because 6 months of protection is a lot better than COVID-19. And frankly, if we need to come back with boosters, we can always do that later on. But it's much better that we try to eliminate this virus right now. We really need to get people on board with trying to get vaccinated, because we need to try to help prevent COVID-19 from becoming a second influenza. And it's something that's a possibility that we can do, because unlike influenza, we have such effective vaccines against COVID-19. Now, maybe we'll learn something for influenza from them, but that's influenza, it's a different virus that has a different set of problems with it. But here we have a virus that seems to be amenable to getting knocked out with the current generation of vaccines. And potentially, if we need to shift them some, we'll also hopefully be able to be knocked out with this kind of very high efficacy. It's actually something that you could actually even think about using the E word, eradication. Now, that is probably not going to happen this year or even next year, but it's something that we might want to eventually work towards, because it would be nice not to have another virus circulating that's just waiting for some variant to come along that's going to once again sweep across the globe. Much better to just wipe it off the face of the earth, much the same way as we've done with smallpox and how we've nearly done with polio, if we can get there. Can't say we're going to. This is one of those things I dream about. Just so you know, there are public health service people public health people who might say, Dr. Marks is nuts. We're not going to do that. It's not going to ever happen, blah, blah, blah. It's a nice dream to have, because otherwise we're going to be having to make a lot of vaccine and spend a lot of effort on this and be at risk for years to come.
Dr. Marks, I want to pose a question that's a little outside of the scope of the FDA, but I know it's on the minds of a lot of us, which is that there does seem to be, in many communities, a disparity between those who are of higher income. Perhaps they have more time during the day. They're not on the clock, being able to spend all that time it's taking to get a vaccine appointment, and not perhaps skipping the line, but perhaps just having more time to really work the system. How do we get the registration systems to the point where people who are lower income and have different kinds of barriers to making those appointments can make them?
Yeah, I think probably we're going to have to be in a situation where we get to mass vaccination clinics at some point, where they're readily accessible to somebody who doesn't have to sit there on. I've heard all sorts of things, like people doing like concert. I remember when my daughter was really into One Direction and she wanted One Direction tickets. I remember sitting in front of the computer when she was about 12, like hitting refresh after refresh. And I've heard enough people doing this for vaccines. We shouldn't have to do that. And we should make sure that this is readily accessible. People shouldn't, people who have to go to work, in jobs and work long hours at jobs shouldn't have to come home and try to game the vaccination system. So I think we're going to have to find ways to make this more possible. I know that the CDC and I know that this administration understands that, and they're looking into ways to doing it. I don't know all the ways they're going to. I wish I could explain to you how they're going to roll this out, but I know that the concept of mass vaccination campaigns, sites that might be able to give many vaccines over time, is one of the solutions here, so that you don't have to have a computer, and so that you don't even absolutely have to have a cell phone. Although, we are lucky that a lot of people do have cell phones, but still, we want to make it so that anybody can get vaccinated.
Thank you. Terry, I think we've just got a couple more minutes with Dr. Marks, but Terry, I think we have one more question.
Just what are the parameters now that you're thinking about and considering necessary for herd immunity? You mentioned they're approaching that, they might get to it in Israel. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, well, I think it'll be really helpful to see whether other countries get there and what happens. But I think the hope was by the time you got to about 70 to 80% of the population vaccinated, you would get towards herd immunity. Now, we have to remember that since we can't vaccinate right now under age 16, you have to average in here. And whether it's truly 70%, whether it's a little less, whether it's a little more, we don't know for sure. But we've got to get up there, upwards of that to that range to have the kind of herd immunity. And that would be, we know that from other vaccines. There are some infectious diseases where you need to be closer to 90%, others where you probably can be closer to 70%, but it's going to be in that range somewhere, which means we do need to get over vaccine hesitancy. I mean, it's just something that we're going to have to work through here. And that's why I think it's nice that we have, some people, if it's hard, some people it's hard enough for them to go once to get vaccinated. It's wonderful that we have a great one dose option for those people. Others, they'll be fine going back twice. It's fine. They'll, if they see some advantage to that, perhaps they're happy to make that extra trip. So it's good to have some variety here with very good vaccines.
Well, vaccine hesitancy is still an issue, although declining somewhat, but I was pleased to see that Dolly Parton, in addition to her generous contribution to the Moderna vaccine and not skipping the line, she actually changed the words to one of her songs, one of my favorite songs, Jolene. Have you heard this?
Yes,
I won't sing it because I don't have a good voice, but vaccine, 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 vaccine. I'm begging of you, please don't hesitate.
Yep.
So courtesy of Dolly Parton, but she is doing PSAs and, doing what she can, like many others to, reach out to those who may still have concerns.
From the work we've done with the Reagan-Udall Foundation, I think that probably some of the most helpful things are the more people like that go out and get vaccinated, you can talk all you want, but if you've gone out and the people seeing people getting vaccinated that they relate to, that's going to get them to go get vaccinated. And that's what has to happen.
Dr. Marks, you have so much on your plate. It's always just a great honor and pleasure to be able to host you. And you always provide so much information when you do join us. So thank you again. Thank you to you and your colleagues for the round-the-clock work that you're doing to help to keep us safe.
Thanks so much for listening, and be safe. Take care.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.